So bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speakers today, who are going to talk to us and improve our understanding of how recent and forthcoming provincial elections are likely to impact the federalism, intergovernmental relations, and the trade policies in Canada. And second, they will talk about what is the potential impact of these intergovernmental debates on the next federal election, which is coming soon, and the trade policy in Canada. And third, they will talk about the challenges Canada is currently facing in the trade negotiations internationally and also across provinces. So today's speakers for our panel are well known for their work and expertise in comparative federalism and multi-level governance, international trade, Chinese economy, political and economic relations between US and Canada. Our first speaker, Ms. Thompson, is the director of the Wilson Center's Canada's Institute, named one of Canada's top 100 foreign policy influencers by the Hill Times. Ms. Thompson is a speaker, writer, and thought leader on Canada-US, USMCA, CPTPP, and international trade issues. Ms. Thompson currently serves as a member of Canada's Deputy Minister's Advisory Committee on Trade. Our second speaker, Professor Broschik, is from Wilfrid Laurier University. He is the Canada Research Chair in Comparative Federalism and Multi-Level Governance. And his research focused on the patterns and long-term consequences of federal reforms, the causes of federalism and defederalization, economic integration in multi-level systems through trade, policy, and theories and methods in the fields of comparative federalism and multi-level politics. And our third speaker, Professor Van Ash, is from HEC Montreal, and he is the deputy editor of the Journal of International Business Policy. In 2017, he co-edited the book, Redesigning Canadian Trade Policy for the New Global Realities, which received the 2018 Doug Purvis Memorial Prize. So we'd like to extend a special welcome to our guests of honors.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. This is working. You can hear me okay? It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a beautiful room. It is the best of Montreal and Quebec tradition and history. I live in the United States. I've been doing Canada-US Relations for many years. I used to tell Americans, if you want to understand Canada, you have to read Robertson Davies. Now I say, if you want to understand Canada, read Louise Penny. For the younger folks in the room that aren't reading about Chief Inspector Gamache, he and Louise Penny are the best ambassadors that Canada currently has in the United States. I was at an American Library of Congress book festival a couple of months ago, and it was packed to the rafters, 10,000 people singing the praises of Quebec and Gamache and Penny. So keep it coming. She's your secret weapon. As I said, I'm not a serious academic. These guys are the serious academics. I'm an interpreter of Canada for the US and the US for Canada. I've been doing this stuff primarily related to international trade agreements for 25 years. I was an academic. I didn't really have a book in me. I worked for both the US government and the Canadian government. I have run a government relations. Again, for you kids in the room, that's a lobbying firm. I was an advisor to the US ambassador in Ottawa. I currently do some advisory work for the Canadian Ministry of Trade. And so I try to be a friendly fixer moving back and forth across the border. And trying to interpret what's going on in trade. 5 years ago, if you had said, I'm looking for a job as an academic, as the Nafta professor of anything in Canada, US, or Mexico, we would, oh my God, that's career suicide. Now, North America is sexy and hot again, though not necessarily for reasons that we would have chosen. It's been a rough couple of years, and it's probably going to continue to be a rough couple of years, and maybe even more, because I am not convinced that Donald Trump is not a two-term president. So let's continue to watch this space. So in the area of federalism, our theme this morning, federalism in Canada's shifting political landscape, I think there's 3 key points that we need to make with respect to cross-border trade policy and the provinces and territories. And I apologize in advance. I'm going to say provinces, but you know I mean provinces and territories every single time I say that. The first point is to recognize the increasing legitimacy of provinces as actors in free trade negotiations and in implementation and in dispute settlement. So that'd be point 1. The second would be to recognize the increasing importance of provinces as tools of consensus building and advocacy south of the border in the United States, but also elsewhere in the world. And third, the continuing challenge for Canada of being a very small and diverse economy, having 10 minutes in a meeting to present its national strategy, but having in that 10 minutes to reflect softwood lumber and Ontario manufacturing, Quebec high-tech, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Canada is plagued by the tyranny of small numbers. So backing up, let's think about the role of provinces and territories in free trade agreements. Way back in 1984, 85, as we were beginning to ramp up negotiations for the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, folks like Jake Warren, some of you may know that name, were brought to consult with the Government of Canada as the representative for Quebec on provincial interests at the free trade negotiations. But in those days, Ottawa said, well, you don't want all those guys at the table. It's going to be really complicated. And what happens if we have 10 provinces and the U.S. brings in 50 states? We won't get anything done. So the provinces were brought in as consultants, perhaps, but were not given real hands-on role, nor were they recognized for their constitutional authority over many important economic aspects in Canada that are defined in the Constitution. So parenthetically, when I'm talking to Americans about how policy gets made, I compare Canada's provinces to the role of the U.S. Congress as a source of checks and balances, a sober second thought that just slows things down, especially if you have a case of a majority in the federal parliament. So the Canadian provinces are much, much more influential in the conduct and administration of trade policy than their U.S. counterparts are. And over the years, we have now found that the provinces have become much more expert in their management of trade issues. They've developed very strong provincial trade ministries and strong expertise. They have become a bit of a blocking mechanism, because even though treaties are negotiated at the federal level, it is the responsibility of the provinces to implement all those commitments. So they don't want a situation like Danny Williams a few years ago in Newfoundland, who expropriated the Abitibi-Bowater assets and said, these are mine, sorry about your luck, and Abitibi-Bowater takes the Government of Canada to trade court over that issue. So it has been a brokerage, a negotiated relationship between the provinces and the federal government on the conduct and negotiation of trade agreements. We see them getting stronger in the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, in the Nafta, in the CETA with the European Union. Then flash forward to the, what do we call it here? Canada-US Mexico Agreement, the CUSMA. I prefer, because it gets a laugh, USMACA. You know, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, you smack a Canada, you smack a Mexico, and you get a deal. Canada was extraordinarily capable during these last very, very difficult negotiations with the Americans in launching what we call the Canadian Maple Charm Offensive. Yes, there were differences back home, but when they got across the border to my side of things, they marched in lockstep. We had provincial premiers and federal representatives out beating down the doors, making sure that Americans understood the importance of this relationship. Not only that, there were too many Canadians in Washington. Nobody was really listening to their messaging in Washington, because in Washington, unless you can mobilize dollars or votes, you're not that interesting. But when those same premiers went to talk to state governors, talk to mayor counterparts in the region, and can say, hey, did you know that Bombardier has 20,000 jobs here in the Kansas 7th? And I'm making that up, but only slightly. When they started to identify areas of mobilization, areas of influence, those folks made a lot of difference. Also, premiers and members of parliament, they're elected. And so when you get those elected guys out doing advocacy and lobbying with other elected guys, it goes a lot further than those very nice, hardworking bureaucrats. So they have become increasingly important as tools of consensus building and education in the United States. But the third challenge, of course, is just Canada has the tyranny of a great deal of economic diversity and a very small population. Trying to make an impact in the United States is extraordinarily difficult. The population of Canada and the GDP of Canada is roughly the same as California. Canada wants to punch above its weight in the United States, and sometimes it can, but when you're only given a finite period of time to press your case in Washington, and you've got to do Atlantic seafood and high-tech and automotive and Devil's Lake water, whatever the heck that is, it just becomes a bit of a mess. And I've heard many times from American policymakers going, that was such a nice Canadian. What the heck did he want? So this is not something that we Canadians are going to get over quickly, but it's something we really need to focus on as we're dealing with these large monoliths, whether it's the United States, China, or European Union. Work out the differences here at home, and then when we pack our bags, have a very clear list of requests and offers. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for such an enlightening speech. Okay. So let's welcome our second speaker, Professor Bronschick.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this panel here. I received these 3 questions on Monday and thought a little bit about how I would address them. Just maybe in one sentence about my background. I'm actually sort of a federalism scholar who discovered an interest in trade maybe 4 years ago. And we, together with a number of colleagues, one of my colleagues at Laurier, Patricia Goff, and others, we developed sort of a grant proposal, a partnership development grant, which we received. And the idea of this research is to work with partners and other scholars to inquire and examine why and how sub-federal entities in North America, that means Mexico, United States, and Canada, in the European Union and Australia, which is another federal system that is interesting in this respect, how they participate and become engaged in trade policy. So what are the motivations behind that? What are the patterns? How get they involved, etc. So this is the background, and from this emerging research, I'm sort of developing some responses to the questions that I received on Monday. So the first question was about the potential impact recent provincial elections, I assume you mean like Ontario, Quebec, and maybe prospectively Alberta, will have for a Canadian trade policy. So my starting point for this is, on the one hand, I think we know about Canada that there has been a deeper path of more closer collaboration vertically and horizontally among the provinces and territories and the federal government since probably, I don't know, starting in the 80s and getting more intensified. It peaked with CETA, of course, where the provinces were sitting at the table. That was kind of exceptional. Nevertheless, we hear from our contacts that like the degree of collaboration has been very good, also in the latest Nafta 0.2 negotiations, TPP as well. So that is good because it shows that there's probably potential for resilience regardless of whether we see new governments coming. On the other hand, from a comparative perspective, we also have to acknowledge that the degree of institutionalization in intergovernmental relations is still comparatively weak. And this at the same time makes these relationships vulnerable. They have remained ad hoc and they are still rather informal compared to what we know, for example, from Switzerland or Germany, where there's much more formalization in intergovernmental relations. So one sort of suggestion coming out of this would be to think about how intergovernmental relations in trade could be further institutionalized, maybe both horizontally and vertically. One idea that we had was thinking about maybe an intergovernmental framework agreement on trade policy. That is something to be discussed. On the other hand, or that is my second sort of response to this question, we have to think about what motivates provincial governments to become engaged in trade policy. And from a comparative perspective, we see three types of interests that are important. There's first economic interests, of course, regional economic interest. Second, what we would call bureaucratic or institutional interest. That means how does a trade agreement affect the institutional capacity of a government? And third, there are political interests. This is particularly important for the European cases. For Canada, our sort of first insight would be regional economic interests are the main driving force, maybe paired with some institutional factors, but the regional economic interests remain more or less persistent, and so far I wouldn't expect too much change from provincial elections. For example, not lead to probably maybe a conservative government.
Oh, you can say it, Jason can.
Okay. Second question was, like, what should the role of the federal government be in terms of the maybe uneven distributive consequences of trade policy agreements? Is there a stronger role for the federal government here? I think there are two positions. If we talk to trade people, they say usually, well, trade is trade, and compensation is something that should be separately dealt with. For example, farmers should be compensated for new concessions now in the Nafta 0.2 and CETA, etc. The other position is, and this is what we're seeing with the progressive trade agreement agenda of the federal government or the European trade for all strategy, there's a paradigm shift going on, obviously, at least in some parts of the world, arguing for a more encompassing approach to trade policy that includes gender, environment, social standards, etc. So these are, I think, two competing or coexisting paradigms that are in the air. And the question then is, what would we prefer? What would be a good way? And what are the prerequisites for sort of implementing this? On a very general level, and maybe it's not the best to say this in Quebec, but I still believe it should probably be a co-approach between a kind of federal leadership on the one hand, paired with provincial horizontal initiatives. And that leads me to the third question, and I will address this in 2 minutes. Cross-provincial conflicts between trade and environment, how can we tackle them? Again, we have on the one hand, I think, a development, especially since Trudeau replaced Harper, and also if we take into account what happened early on the provincial level, that Canada is not on the worst way, I'll put it that way. It's maybe even on a good way, to some extent at least. We have provincial initiatives in climate change policies. We have the federal government trying at least to initiate a new policy change. That is at least something. On the other hand, we all know that we need a much more dramatically accelerated and ambitious effort to tackle environmental problems and balance these different goals. I don't know, there are different scenarios, and I don't want to clearly argue for one, but I just want to throw it out here. One could think, of course, about a new national policy maybe, given that these challenges are really tough and huge. However, the question is this an opportunity, or is this a realistic scenario in the 21st century? So the second scenario, and maybe it would be good to think about both ways, is building on what Thomas Carcine a couple of years ago called pan-Canadian provincialism. That means the provinces, through horizontal cooperation, define also what pan-Canadian goals in this respect are, balancing trade and environmental issues. So again, I think, similar to my answer to the second question, it's maybe a good way to think about a good sort of combination about federal leadership and what Fritz Schaaf, a German scholar, has called the shadow of hierarchy, with increased horizontal efforts through the provinces and territories. And I say this clearly because if we take a look at Europe, for example, we can learn that from sub-federal governments there can be a push, or they can push for more ambitious and more progressive trade agendas. This is exactly what happened with CETA, for example, and others. It was Wallonia, it was the French community, it was the German lender, the Austrian lender, who pushed for higher standards, who threatened to veto the ratification of trade agreements, and that triggered federal governments, but more so even maybe the European Union, to be more responsive to these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's welcome. Okay, let's welcome our third speaker, Professor Van Asch.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a yet different angle on the whole thing. I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist. Hello?
I have a great mic. You want to use mine?
Thank you.
You're a business guy. I will let you have it for 20 bucks.
So I'm an economist, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this issue from an economic viewpoint. I'm going to be looking at how trade patterns have been changing in the last couple of decades, and I'm going to argue that these change in trade patterns actually make that the role of provinces in free trade agreements actually has been rising over time. And so in order to understand this, it's actually useful to look at how we were used to thinking about trade and then also trade policy, and then kind of see how things have started changing in recent decades, how this has changed, led to new motives for doing trade, and how this has led to new trade policy demands. So the way we traditionally think about international trade is that, which you can see in any kind of textbook out there, is that you've got firms located in many different countries. These firms each produce a good, and then what they do is they decide whether or not they want to sell this good only in their local market, or whether they also want to start exporting it to other countries. And so ultimately, in this kind of way of thinking about why companies trade, it is all about gaining consumers in foreign markets. So you want to do trade because trade allows you to gain market access into other countries. And so in this kind of a framework, the reason why firms talk to governments is because they want governments to help them to gain further access in foreign markets. It's all about increasing your consumer base. So trade agreements then, of course, are all about exporters who want to increase their foreign market access, importers who want to, at the same time, also gain increase in foreign market access as well. And so in a trade agreement, you have kind of a changing of favors between the two countries where both firms are able to start trading. And so this is how we've been used to thinking about international trade in the past, but it is less and less in line with how trade really is working. And the reason is that companies nowadays are no longer making their products within a factory in their home country. You've all, in the last couple of years, certainly heard a lot about global value chains, where a lot of products that we are consuming is not made by one company in one country. It's made by many different companies that each produce components that then eventually is assembled somewhere and then is being sold to different places around the world. Okay, now this is really important because companies that are a part of a global value chain are doing trades not only to reach foreign consumers, but they're doing this for many other reasons as well. They're doing this because by conducting international trades, they're able to gain access to cheaper inputs. So they might be able to get an input from China that is much cheaper than they would be able to get it from the United States. Or they might find out that actually there is an input from the United States that is of higher quality than they can find on the local market, and that allows them to become more competitive. They might kind of say, well, we want to conduct international trades, not just to become more efficient, but because it allows us to become more flexible. Okay? So right now we're kind of in an environment with a lot of uncertainty. So being able to source a product from one country and then at another moment from another country actually allows you to circumvent a lot of barriers that are now being put into place. So again, these firms are thinking about trade as a way of making their supply chain more efficient, more effective. They might do it because international trade allows them to gain access to new knowledge. And this new knowledge allows them to become more innovative in their home country. So there's a lot of new reasons why companies are conducting international trade that just has nothing to do with gaining more consumers in foreign countries. And this is important because these firms that are integrating into global value chains, when they go to policymakers and ask them to help them out with trade policy, they kind of say, well, yes, we would appreciate having more market access in foreign countries, but in addition to that, can you also please help us build better relationships with our suppliers? So we want to have reductions on the import side so we can buy inputs more cheaply. We want to perhaps have a harmonization of regulations so that we can really talk the same language with our suppliers. We want to make sure that there is a better transportation infrastructure that is really better integrated between countries, because that allows us again to become more competitive on international markets. So they're asking for a lot of things that were not really present in the older trade agreements. They're asking for things that go beyond at the border barriers toward beyond the border barriers. Okay? And this is exactly where the provinces come in. So at the border barriers of tariffs and quotas and all these things, it's clear that these are issues that are under the federal jurisdiction when we're talking about trade policy. But the moment that we start talking about issues beyond the border, transportation infrastructure, maybe some immigration, maybe some education, environment, etc. These are things that oftentimes start entering into the provincial jurisdictions. And so simply because of the changing way how we are conducting trade, we're seeing that there is a new balance that has to be made between federal governments and provincial governments in trade negotiations. Now, we see this all the time, so that this has become a much more important issue. When there was discussions about CETA, at that moment, or Nafta renegotiation, every province had their own provincial negotiator who was there and who was also giving their feedback on what they believed was important for Quebec or for other provinces. So this issue is an issue that is very well known in Canada and also in Europe. I'm from Belgium originally, so Belgium also had their own issues with CETA as well. And so, so these are issues that are becoming much more important around the world as we are thinking about trade as being something that is much more than simply getting rid of barriers at the border, but going beyond the border. So I might kind of leave it here, and then we can go for questions.
Oh, thank you all for such enlightening. So we appreciate you have all our questions clarified. So now we open our question and answers period. So basically, from the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we will have we will have staff members to bring the microphone to you. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, so my question is for Prof. I don't want to massacre your last name, Broske?
Broske.
Yeah, hi. So I was very interested with what you were talking about having this kind of pan-Canadian policy with the province, horizontal thing you were talking about. I think that's great, and I think that it would help to institutionalize our intergovernmental relations. and I think about this a lot, but I'm just kind of worried, how can the federal government show leadership to try to have something like this done without the obvious accusation of centralization? And, you know, because it's always like that. Anytime we try to do something all together, all the provinces, if the federal is going to have a leadership role, or maybe should we shift the narrative when it comes to centralization? Would it be the role of the federal government to try to change that narrative and give more power to the provinces, or at least make them feel like they've had more autonomy in doing something like that? Is that clear? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Please.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question, and I was consciously sort of trying to be sort of leave it a little bit open. But if we take a look at how the Council of the Federation, for example, came into existence, it had a lot to do with the fact that the then federal government maybe demonstrated a wrong form of leadership by, as I think Richard Simeon once called it, exercising the spending power in reverse, frustrating the provinces, and then also at some point leaving, that applies maybe even more so to Harper, don't show any leadership at all in the federal arena. So the Council of the Federation and horizontal cooperation on the multilateral scale, but also maybe in a plurilateral scale, thinking about the Western provinces signing 2 quite ambitious internal trade agreements, on also other provinces. I think about Ontario and Quebec more recently. So there was obviously a lack of real federal leadership, which opened a space for the provinces to fill it. So that is one thing, and I personally think it's a very good way to innovate in the Canadian context without causing too much conflict and frustration among the provinces, because it's always a very delicate sort of situation when the federal government exercises leadership. We all know that. However, I personally was also carefully optimistic when the new federal government came, at first at least, was elected and rolled out this new concept of collaborative federalism, promising a more collaborative approach, not only with the provinces and territories, but also indigenous communities. I'm less optimistic today, I have to admit this, but nevertheless, you can notice there are differences. And I think that leads me to my, again, maybe ambitious sort of answer to your question. For the Canadian context, also historically, I think in the long term, what has spurred innovation was an interplay of federal leadership and also provincial innovation. They contradict themselves maybe, and they create tensions and frictions, but at the end of the day, that led to, for example, a universal healthcare system. It may also lead at some point to a universal pharmacare system, or maybe a more coherent approach to climate change, or early childhood development. So I can think about several examples, and the pattern, at least in my view, has always been this like interplay of provinces and the federal government. What I would just warn, my negative contrast is the German case, which is a completely different intergovernmental system where you have what Sharp has called joint decision making. That means a sort of a mandatory system where the federal level and the sub-federal level have to find a solution more or less anonymously, otherwise there's just no change and the status quo will prevail. And I think this would definitely not work in the Canadian case. So I found it always more flexible, despite the fact that it also caused frictions, for sure.
Can I jump in? I'm going to be the contrarian. I'm from Alberta, so when you say national policy, I think national energy policy, and I go, oh my God. My general belief is that on matters of commerce, it is the job of the government to reduce the barriers between willing buyers and willing sellers as far as possible. And once in a while, you can make a public policy case for keeping barriers up for various reasons. But we're really looking at ways of facilitating trade to increase prosperity. Now, I'm not being a Reagan trickle-down economist that, that's all you need. You need many good, strong social and education policies as well, but you don't get those by distorting markets. And so, for example, I know cultural policy is hugely contentious across Canada, but do you actually encourage more Canadian innovation by keeping American cultural products out, which was easier to do in the 80s, but much more difficult to do in the digital age. And so I think in terms of a national policy or mitigating, brokering federal provincial territorial interests with the national interest, I think you want to provide just the broadest possible framework to ensure inclusion. You have no-fly zones, certain areas where we as Canadians have decided this is an objective or this is a policy we want to uphold, but then you allow the provinces to be the provinces. And so, for example, the province of Quebec is extraordinarily good at its foreign relations. The Quebec office in Washington is amazing, and they don't call Ottawa every time they want to do something. They do consult with Ottawa to make sure they're not stepping in it, and on an issue like aluminum tariffs, which are incredibly important, and softwood lumber, incredibly important. It's a process of consultation, collaboration. Whoever does the job best should do the job. And so again, Quebec has been extraordinarily good, and I applaud them because they have managed this year some very difficult protectionist issues. They've had to wave the flag on dairy protection. They've had to try to restore market access for aluminum. They've been caught up in softwood lumber at the same time as they are out promoting investment every single day in innovation and health sciences and energy. And Hydro-Quebec is running up and down the road telling Americans that they're the North American battery. And they managed to do these conflicting or diverse tasks very, very well. And if that was centralized in Ottawa, first of all, I don't think the Quebecers would stand for it, but secondly, it would not be nearly as effective. Quebec, Alberta, Ontario all have very strong direct representation in the United States and abroad, and they do a great job. But the problem, there's nobody there from the Maritimes. People come to me from the White House and the State Department and say, give us a briefing on the Maritimes. What's going on in New Brunswick? I'm like, I don't know. Let me pick up the phone and call Halifax. So there are folks who don't have the capacity or the resources to be as well represented on the international trade and export promotion and investment promotion scene as others. So there should be some mechanism for equalization, but the very nice, very entertaining visits from the premiers once a year are not good enough. It needs to come from the commercial level. It needs to come from the innovators and the businesses who are working effectively across borders.
Very good. Thank you. So we are open for...
there's a lady right there.
Okay.
Mon nom est Josée Bergeron. Je travaille au secrétariat du Québec aux relations intergouvernementales. Alors, vous comprendrez que mes propos ne reflètent que mes positions et non pas celles du secrétariat. Ceci dit, j'ai un commentaire et une question. Le commentaire porte sur les relations intergouvernementales. La comparaison avec l'Europe est toujours utile, a cependant ses limites. On avait fait l'exercice il y a 10 ans de calculer combien de relations on pouvait avoir dans une année d'échange, c'est-à-dire puis on ne comptait même pas le niveau ministériel, sous-ministériel, on n'était qu'au niveau des fonctionnaires, et on avait estimé que c'était entre 5 000 et 8 000 échanges, et ça, c'était avant l'Internet, ce qu'on connaît aujourd'hui d'Internet. Donc, ça relève à 10 ans. Donc, j'ai un petit peu de difficulté à la comparaison sur l'institutionnalisation des relations intergouvernementales pour dire si elles sont faibles ou fortes. Les relations intergouvernementales au Canada sont multiples, se jouent à plusieurs niveaux et sont constantes. Un exemple, c'est le Conseil de la Fédération qui a été créé par les provinces où on a discuté de plusieurs enjeux, dont les questions de libre-échange. Laura a répondu directement à un des commentaires que j'avais sur le leadership et la question de l'intérêt pan-canadien. Fait qu'on voit là, encore une fois, le pragmatisme albertain qui rejoint certaines positions du Québec. Ma question, c'est beaucoup plus sur la difficulté qu'on a comme fédération, dans la mesure où nos rapports économiques sont beaucoup plus nord-sud qu'est-ouest. Donc, il y a un circuit économique qui ne répond pas nécessairement à la division politique ou institutionnelle qu'on trouve au Canada. Donc, est-ce que jusqu'à quel point, justement, cette intégration nord-sud ne vient pas en clash avec le système institutionnel qu'on a? Merci.
Merci beaucoup. So, I guess Professor Van Ash want to take the question?
Donc, il me fait un plaisir d'essayer de répondre. Il me ferait un plaisir d'essayer de répondre à votre question. Je ne suis pas un expert des institutions, etc. Donc, mais effectivement, on voit beaucoup de préoccupations que les différentes provinces ont concernant le commerce entre les provinces canadiennes et les États américains. Et c'est pour une très bonne raison, c'est que toute la population, toute l'économie économique au Canada est très proche à la frontière américaine. Et donc, pour cette raison, le commerce est énormément important pour notre productivité, pour notre état de vie, etc. Donc, naturellement, il y a aussi beaucoup d'échanges entre les différentes provinces canadiennes. Et donc, mais une chose que des études démontrent bien est que entre les provinces, malgré le fait qu'il n'y a pas de tarifs douaniers, il n'y a pas de quotas, etc., il y a néanmoins beaucoup de coûts de commerce entre les provinces aussi. Donc, j'ai vu une étude de 2017 qui a démontré qu'en moyenne, entre les provinces canadiennes, il y a quelque chose qui ressemble à un tarif douanier de 7%. Donc, ça veut dire que s'il y a une entreprise de Colombie-Britannique qui essaie d'exporter quelque chose à Québec, nous payons autour de 7% de plus que si ça aurait été donc à Colombie-Britannique. Et donc, la raison, naturellement, c'est que tous ces... le fait que les systèmes de transport, le fait que les réglementations, etc., ne sont pas les mêmes entre les différentes provinces, ça crée des difficultés pour les entreprises de faire du commerce dans ces différentes régions. Et donc, pour cette raison, l'idée d'avoir donc plus de discussions sur comment assurer qu'il y a un meilleur commerce entre les différentes provinces est importante, est aussi importante qu'avoir des discussions avec nos plus grands partenaires à l'Europe ou aux États-Unis. Donc, j'espère que ça répond un peu à votre question.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
And I apologize for my linguistic limitation. I'll try in English. Obviously, North-South trade is extraordinarily important across regions. When you go to British Columbia, you're not in Western Canada. You're in this Pacifica thing that is linked up with Washington and Oregon. Similarly, the family relationships across the border from Quebec into New England states are deeply, tightly integrated. So we have always traded better and had more affinity, north and south. As Canadians, though, we are different, and we have certain values and principles that we hold to be very important: diversity, multiculturalism, universal health care, et cetera. But I don't find that there are that many things within the trade realm that, when you unpack them, are actually matters of sovereignty. Dairy sovereignty, car seat sovereignty, softwood lumber sovereignty. I don't see that. I think as Canadians, we have to be very careful to identify what are the things that are important. And if it is protecting dairy farmers, it's protecting dairy farmers. And if it is protecting culture, then it is protecting culture. But I see too many politicians inserting the sovereignty argument into places it just doesn't belong. That, we can't have regulatory alignment with the United States because, those jerks are going to come up and drain our lakes and take over our hydroelectric plants, which was an argument during the free trade agreement negotiations. For example, a car seat that is made in Quebec is sold at a toy store or a child store in Florida and is not legal to be sent back into Canada unless it has 2 new inspections, even though we love our children as much as they love our children, and that car seat is equally safe in all places, and we have, very similar consumer safety rules, etc. So while it is important to identify our no-fly zones and essential areas of sovereignty, I get very impatient with politicians that try to use the broad brush of sovereignty to win a political debate where they probably should not be moving in. And I think we're going to see this in the next election. We are going to see a federal election. We're going to see politicians positioning themselves not against their Canadian opponents, but against Donald Trump. None of them are running against Donald Trump, but it is a political expedient to go against that guy.
Thank you. Thank you. So do we have more questions? Yes, please. Yes.
Yes, sure. I don't have a microphone, but I speak really loud, so that should be fun. You just mentioned the T word, so Donald Trump again, and of course, we talk about the next federal campaign, and I'm asking you a question, Laura, because you're based in DC, you're on the Mall, very close to the Congress, and not that far from the White House, at the Woodrow Wilson Center. So, what do you think that Trump is so unpredictable in so many ways? How do you think that Canada-US relations could play a role in the forthcoming federal elections? And Trump himself, his personality, his tweets, and sometimes out of nowhere we start to attack dairy farmers here and there, or and how is this how can this affect in a way the forthcoming federal campaign here in Canada? Because until the SNC-Lavalin story, because it's a story that keeps giving, we see that even today, we're looking more at the US for political entertainment in the last 2 years. But this could come back because, again, Trump is still, a lot of things are happening in domestic politics in the US, but things also are, he can attack Canada or any other country at any time, and we don't know what will happen. And certainly Canada is on his radar screen. We've seen that in the past. So how can this play out in the next 6 months? And yeah.
Well, Donald Trump has said that he's actually doing Justin Trudeau. He has done Justin Trudeau a favor. He says, every time I say something bad about that guy, his rankings go up in the polls. So saying bad things about Justin, he never calls him Mr. Trudeau or Prime Minister Trudeau. It's always Justin. Saying bad things about Justin is just doing him a favor. And I think we have moved past that dynamic, though. The president. Any of my bosses here listening? We're live streaming. Okay, turn off the live stream just for a minute. The president has treated the trade negotiations like a mouse, like a cat and a mouse, and I think the mouse is really and truly dead. He's just not interested in NAFTA USMCA as much as he was now. His sights have gone elsewhere. He's looking at China. He's looking at Europe. He's looking at Korea. He's looking at good guys and bad guys and the ghost of John McCain. He has not paid much attention to these Canadians that are ultimately kind of dull to begin with. So I don't think that to that extent it's going to, he is going to interfere in the Canadian election campaign, but I think the real challenge is for the Canadian representatives to not define themselves relative to the United States. Of course, everybody knows Canada's better on immigration, but what specifically does Canada stand for? How much openness on immigration? How much universality in healthcare? How much attention to emissions? How much can Canadians afford within that context? What's happening with Canadian competitiveness? My view is that Canada is in for a rocky road over the next 2 to 4 years. I mean, the trade is with the U.S. is reducing at the same time as new markets in the TPP are not picking up quickly. The tax differential between the U.S. and Canada is very high and getting higher. The regulatory costs in Canada are much higher in Canada than the United States. So if you're an investor from another country, where are you going to put your money? US or Canada? I think the answer right now is the United States. So Canada's going to have to dance very quickly to put together a compelling argument for its continued economic viability and attractiveness as a place to live and a place to invest.
Thank you. So, yes, please.
Microphone.
We frequently hear that as Canadians, we're much better at organizing free trade relations with other countries than we are in breaking down the trade barriers within our own country amongst the provinces. I'd like your comment on this. Do you think that is a valid criticism, that we aren't doing enough to break down our own internal trade barriers?
Well, there's something to this argument for sure. I mean, Douglas Brown has written a lot on the history of internal trade constraints and how they persisted over time. But you could, of course, also make this argument because Canada is so good at launching new trade agreements with other countries. This has, again, in turn, an impact on the reduction, maybe not complete elimination of internal trade agreements as well. So CETA is maybe one important example. That was one of the reasons why the European Union wanted to have the provinces and territories sitting at the negotiation table when it came to certain aspects of the agreement. And that has certainly, I would say, facilitated to some extent. At least it has sort of facilitated debate. It eventually led to the kind of replacement of the former AIT with the new Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So there is progress, although at the same time, and that has, again, I would say a lot to do with the history of Canadian federalism, of the path dependence, if you want to call it this way, of the institutions, that these trade barriers will always to some extent persist. And that's also an important difference to other federations, most notably Germany, where you don't have this problem at all, which has a lot to do with the fact that already in the 19th century they abolished these trade agreements, and that was sort of became locked in. So, but my quick answer would be yes, but through the international trade agreements, we see a reduction of internal trade agreements as well.
Thank you.
I'll agree with my two colleagues here. So as already indicated before, barriers within Canada between provinces is actually much bigger than we think. Estimates was that's kind of around 7% barriers between different provinces. And so, especially in a situation right now where indeed because of the new reality south, where most of our exports are going to, and because of the fact that our competitiveness depends on our integration into global value chains, but in reality, regional value chains. If we want to be competitive in the world economy, if we can't do it with the United States, we should be kind of looking at how we can do it with ourselves. Europe, of course, is important as well. CETA played a very important role there, but still, there's not as much bang for the buck in trying to get things improved with Europe than it is with, for example, inter-provincial trade in Canada. Now, of course, Laura kind of pointed out very nicely that there are political reasons why this is very difficult and politically expedient reasons why you want to not give in on having these discussions, but there's actually, economically speaking, a lot of benefits you can get from being able to get rid of these barriers.
I think this would be a really good question for the Premier's panel that's coming up. Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, every economist agrees that getting rid of protectionist barriers that raise transaction costs is a really good idea. But it's like St. Augustine said, "Lord, grant me chastity, just not right now." You know, let's push that off for the next administration. So, I mean, beer is everybody's favorite. I get beer donated to my office for my Canada Day and Saint Jean Baptiste happy hours in Wilson from the government of Quebec. It's lovely. I say to Alberta, how come you can't donate the beer? So well, it's too expensive for us to get it to Washington because we have to take it all the way across Canada. Our intermediary is in Toronto, and every time that beer crosses a provincial line, we have to pay a tariff as if it were going to its final destination. We can't afford to move beer to Toronto, let alone to Washington. But you know, we agree, well, there must be some benefit to Ontario's LCBO or SAQ. Otherwise, why didn't we get rid of them? They are great sources of provincial revenue. So let's put off that decision till the next guy.
Yeah.
Thank you. So do we have more questions? Yes. Okay, please.
Thank you very much. Guy Lachapelle from Concordia University. One question in English and one in French. First of all, thank you very much. It's quite refreshing to understand that people understand more and more the role of provinces, and essentially Quebec and the business community. My question is from a negotiating point. Are you satisfied with the way the federal government set up the negotiating team and how they did that? And since we will probably have to renegotiate part of it in the next 5 years, how you are going to do it? And are we going to go by sectors or whatever? When we started negotiation in 85, 86 on Nafta, there was one major challenge, was to create North American institutions. We created two secretariats, one on environment and one on labor relationship. These secretariats are almost gone, I guess. Mr. Trump didn't want it. And we lost this opportunity to create such, I would say, a North American institution. And I think it's probably the case also for Pharma and others in the future. Ma question pour la question économique des choses, pourquoi est-ce qu'en Amérique du Nord, on n'est pas capable de créer des zones franches de libre-échange? En Europe, ça a été créé pendant des années. C'est un modèle qui existe en Asie. Et on dirait que dans le contexte nord-américain, on ne comprend pas comment faire des zones facilement. Je dis toujours à mes étudiants, pour en faire une zone sur le sirop d'érable, très facilement avec le Maine, et ça fonctionnerait, tout le monde serait content des deux côtés de la frontière, et ça faciliterait les échanges commerciaux également. Un dernier point peut-être, au Canada, ça semble encore, et c'était l'insuccès des négociations européennes, ça a été elite domination, top-down, et les citoyens étaient opposés en bonne partie. C'est l'échec de l'Europe, ça a été ça. Tous les représentants de la Commission européenne vous le diront, c'est qu'on a besoin d'un système bottom-up un peu plus et que les communautés soient impliquées. Donc, c'est sûr que les provinces et, je dirais même, les municipalités, dans certains cas, ont peut-être des choses à dire. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. So, who wants to take the question?
So the Organization of Trade Negotiations, thank you for that question. That's a great one. I am satisfied enough. First of all, let me say, Canadian trade negotiators are among the leaders anywhere in the world. They're extremely, extremely capable. And that's not just federal, that's provincial as well. We have been, as Canadians, punching above our weight since Canada was a signatory to the GATT in 1948, and we've continued with that leadership. And being the country that holds the pen at a critical international meeting means that a country with 30 or so million people has more clout in the final shape of that agreement. So we have done extremely well. At the same time, we are playing out towards the logical conclusion of a tariff-based trade regime. Our average industrial tariffs are decreasing, 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 and so going to a trade negotiation and talking about tariffs in various sectors is not as productive as it used to be, as just marginal gains, and is more and more difficult to talk about non-tariff barriers. These are hard to get your heads around. As these gentlemen have said, a lot of them are in the area of provinces, a lot of them are rooted in there for very strong political political reasons. So it is a challenge there. So we're going to need to think of a way to manage our external trade relationships, and maybe it isn't through a formal trade negotiation system, but rather through a Canadian trade prosperity promotion entity that really looks at areas of cooperation and barrier reduction and, you know, lighting a candle where you can on things like where can we work with China, rather than getting caught up in an irritants-based approach, which has served us well so far. Now, I think during these last negotiations, Canada, US, Mexico, the Canadian negotiators just did extraordinary work, really, really great work. I mean, it was under such fraught circumstances. The Americans didn't want to be at the table. It wasn't like they came to negotiate a new and better deal. They came to dismantle that deal with poison pills inserted in it, no dispute settlement system, killing off supply management, killing off, you know, many, many things. So those Canadian negotiators just hunkered down. Imagine, you know, playing poker at a table at a cabin, and all of the roof was blowing off and the walls are blowing off, and they continued for many months just going through these technical things to make a better agreement today than we had yesterday. At the same time, I've never seen such a politicized negotiation. So with that kind of interference and intervention going every single day with social media, the negotiators could only do so much. And there's some elements of that deal that are, you know, frankly, god-awful. The rules of origin and management system will do nothing but drive production out of North America. It's extremely expensive, extremely difficult to administer. But I think our negotiators said, better to take the deal we can get today, and then when this guy's gone, we can go back and clean up the messes. I hope that that's what they have done. And so, for the most part, they did extraordinarily well. At the same time, negotiators need politicians to finish up a deal. And so while they did as much as they could at the technical table, they couldn't finish it on their own. Jared Kushner called up David McNaughton, the Canadian ambassador, and said, okay, it's time to finish this. Send us over an Excel spreadsheet with all of the US bottom lines, and we'll go through the list. And Canada, being Canada, sent not only its own bottom lines, but the American bottom lines as well, even though they might have been different from the ones the American had. So Kushner and the ambassadors and Chris Freeland and others sat there going, got it, need it. Why are we fighting over $50 million? That dairy thing's not a big deal, chut. And that's how we got to that deal. Is it the best deal possible? Absolutely not. Was it the best deal possible under the circumstances? Probably.
Thank you so much. We have 15 minutes left, so we can take like 2 to 3 more questions.
Je vais peut-être...
Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Donc, je vais commencer avec votre deuxième question. Est-ce que ça... OK, c'est bien. Donc, concernant la dominance d'élite, donc maintenant, beaucoup plus qu'il y a 5 années ou 10 années, donc on a beaucoup de craintes reliées aux accords de libre-échange et au commerce international, etc. Et, donc, et la raison il y a plusieurs raisons pourquoi on l'a. Donc, on sait bien que le commerce peut créer beaucoup de gains économiques, augmentation de productivité, etc. Mais maintenant, encore plus qu'avant, on sait bien qu'il y a des perdants avec le commerce international. Donc, il y a des études qui ont démontré comment les perdants perdent beaucoup et que c'est difficile pour certaines générations de récupérer de ça. Donc, je pense que ce que le gouvernement de Trudeau a fait avec le commerce progressif était une façon d'essayer effectivement de donner un peu plus d'humanité dans la façon de regarder les accords de libre-échange. Donc l'idée était que peut-être on va réduire un peu les gains de productivité qu'on aura avec un certain accord, mais on va assurer que l'accord est plus inclusif où certains groupes qui vont perdre certainement qu'eux ne perdent pas autant. Et donc, l'idée du gouvernement Trudeau était d'essayer de pousser cette vision sur le commerce international à des autres pays. Donc, pour que les négociations sur les accords de libre-échange deviennent plus humains aussi. Ils l'ont essayé avec la Chine, ça n'a pas fonctionné du tout. Donc, ils ont essayé avec les États-Unis, ça a fonctionné un peu dans le sens qu'il y a des mots-clés de labor et environnement dans l'accord. Ils ont essayé de changer leur vision de l'AECG en le mettant dans cette vision aussi. Donc, donc ça veut dire que, premièrement, ce que vous indiquez est une réalité. Deuxièmement, on voit qu'il y a une réaction politique et je pense que, considérant les contraintes politiques qu'on voit maintenant et la vision que beaucoup de monde a sur le commerce, que c'est une chose qui est devenue très importante pour le futur. Donc, sur la question sur les zones franches, c'est intéressant parce que c'est une chose qui revient chaque quelques années. Donc effectivement, dans beaucoup de régions dans le monde, ils ont des zones franches où il y a beaucoup moins de taxes, il n'y a pas de tarifs douaniers sur les importations, il y a beaucoup d'aides sur l'exportation, etc. Donc, il y a certaines choses que le Canada n'a pas besoin. Donc, par exemple, si tu importes des composants, maintenant tu ne payes déjà, il n'y a pas de tarifs déjà. Donc, naturellement, sur des autres choses, il y a beaucoup d'évidence que les grappes industrielles peuvent créer aussi des augmentations de productivité importantes et donc essayer de créer un buzz dans les grappes industrielles avec des zones franches pourrait être une bonne façon d'essayer de pousser ça. Donc c'est une chose qui pourrait être ajoutée aux super cluster policies qui sont développées, mais ce sont cette sorte de choses qu'on devrait en penser, surtout parce que la chose sur la compétitivité du Canada est une chose qui est préoccupante et on doit être innovateur là-dedans.
Merci beaucoup. Okay, so 2 more questions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the discussion. It's really interesting. I'm Claude Fortin from McGill, and my question is regarding all the subjects discussed during this panel, could you speak to the tech industry and tech innovation, how trade folds into that? With regards to 2 different particular zone issues, one being the different type of tech industry innovations that is provincial. For instance, in Quebec, where the industry is developing in a different way or on different sectors than in BC or Ontario, and also in terms of the zone, the Tech Belt zone, which is from Ontario, well, from the eastern states up to Ontario, around the Great Lakes. Do you have insights about that and how it's different from the other industries you've been discussing?
Can I talk about tech and trade agreements, and then these guys can do serious business stuff? That's one of the great losses, I think, in the U.S.-Canada FTA, or the Nafta, USMACA negotiations, is that we did not get a chance to develop as much in the tech sector as we should have and could have, as the industry was demanding. What you see in that agreement, because we were very busy focusing on irritants. It's not that the negotiators didn't put it as a priority, but we were so busy focusing on irritants. And they basically took the digital elements of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which the U.S. was very keen on and was sad to lose the TPP, and just cut and paste them into the U.S.-Canada agreement. But even 4 or 5 years later, from the time they originally wrote those commitments to putting them into the new negotiations, a lot has moved ahead. And so we are really lacking in trade agreements in 2 key areas. One, of course, is ways to really, truly facilitate digital trade. First of all, we can't even really classify it. If I import a heart valve or a valve from my toilet, and it's a physical product, then it's a tradable good. But if I import the digital pattern and I create it on my 3D printer, was that an import? Was that an export? What what was that? Was that a service? Was that a good? So trade negotiators are having a really hard time getting their heads around this stuff and getting regulations that increase access for innovators. I mean, the big guys, the John Deeres who used to sell tractors and now sell IT products, they're going to find a way. But it's the small businesses, the SMEs, that want to be in this space and are unable to work with the existing goods-based trade rules. And then the second area, beyond what is trade, digital trade, and how do you do it, is how do you promote this kind of trade while at the same time maintaining strong national protections for privacy, for movement of cross-border movement of information. What kind of movement of information is good? What kind of movement of information is not good? I mean, it's all being tarred with a fairly large brush, and it's making, for example, financial services companies that would like to be able to do payments and transactions across a border, it's preventing them from doing so, from competing against the rest of the world. So we have not got our head around this well enough yet. Woohoo, the WTO is now picking up its e-commerce negotiations, and that's terrific, and China has agreed to participate. But their operational document for those negotiations is from, wait for it, 1998, before most people had internet in their homes. So nobody is making effective headway in this area in terms of how we protect and how we promote.
Thank you. So one last question.
Oh, these guys.
So sorry.
You want to comment? Okay, sorry.
I'll keep it short. So, so when we talk about global value chains, we very rapidly start thinking about a car, where certain components are being imported, and the final good kind of is being sent to another country. So we think about physical goods, but in reality, actually, the trend that we see about the fragmentation of production of goods, we're seeing exactly the same thing going on in the fragmentation of innovation as well. So right now, innovation is not simply one kind of laboratory in one location where you've got 10 smart guys that are sitting together and then they are developing a new idea or a new design or whatever it is. What you actually have is very often people that are located in many different countries that actually are collaborating over distance through kind of digital pipelines, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of trade and innovation is really important because there is a lot of evidence that trade and innovation are reinforcing itself. It leads to a lot of questions about how you actually capture trade of digital bids that are being transferred across countries, but this is something really important. So, for example, here in Montreal, we've had a lot of focus on artificial intelligence in recent years. But if you kind of look at companies in AI here in Montreal, they are constantly on planes. These guys are on planes and they're going to Singapore and they're going to Silicon Valley and they're going to Boston and they're going to all these different places because for them being able to develop their new products is not something that is just by simply sitting kind of a bit more kind of to the east, northeast of here. It really has become kind of a global phenomenon. So we need to kind of see innovation and trade to be things that are really linked to one another and then really think about that in the future as well.
We have only 3 more minutes, so I guess we have no time for the last question. So we are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thoughts and expertise with us today. We hope you can join us next year. And the next panel premiere starts at 4 p.m. And so now we can start our coffee break. Thank you all.